And Michael, with the exception of Michael. Or he's not, I don't even see him now.
He's here. He's here.
Thanks, Michael, but all you, many elderly, many young women, it's really a pleasure to be in your presence. So I would like to talk to you about the province's plans to move forward with electricity, so specifically the electricity sector, and how can we move Ontario to a renewable energy future and why we need to do that. And I'll just boot through a very shortened version of my longer presentation. So in Ontario, about a quarter of the energy we use, or climate emissions, come from the electricity sector. So Ontario is one of the only it's maybe the only jurisdiction on the planet that has phased out coal as an electricity source. And we phased it out for environmental and justice reasons, or environmental and health reasons. And that is a real success story due to citizen activism. In the late 90s, some people got together, including my boss, Jack Gibbons, and said, we need to phase out coal for environmental and health reasons, and primarily smog and climate change. They formed a coalition. They got municipalities to sign on to a commitment to phase out coal, and they pressured the provincial government. They were strategic, and they advocated for a coal phase out. They did public awareness campaigns. They got municipalities, they got doctors on side, and they pressured very strategically the provincial government, and they won. And by the end of 2013, we will be under 1% of our electricity from coal, and that down from 25% of our electricity came from coal. So that is a great example of how civil society can change public policy around very major substantive changes. And now the government, well, I should just say it's the single largest climate action in all of North America. It's the equivalent of taking 6 million cars off the road. And jurisdictions and states around North America look to Ontario for that example. But we still have a lot of work to do, climate change, and I'll let Lynn talk more in depth about climate change. It's looking like it's going to be very difficult for us to not increase our emissions beyond the 2-degree mark. And so we really need to phase out fossil fuels and really move to a renewable energy future. We are energy gluttons in Ontario in particular. The first graph is Ontario, the second graph is New York State. We use about 30% more electricity per person in Ontario than they do in New York, and they don't even know that they use less. And we don't even know that we use more. And they have essentially the same economy that we do here in the same climate. And it's just because their governments have invested in conservation and made a strategic plan to reduce their use of energy, and that makes their economy stronger, and it makes their industries more competitive because they're spending much less for electricity than our industries in Ontario. So we're paying more for energy if we're using 30% more. And then compare that to European countries. We use about twice as much electricity per capita than they do in European nations, and it's only because they have taken their commitments to reduce their electricity use much more seriously than we have. They charge more for electricity, and that enables, or it supports, the conservation efforts. And we should be doing the same thing in Ontario, and the only reason we're not is because we have such a glut of energy on the grid, namely because of our high-cost, large, centralized fossil coal and nuclear stations. And just by way of comparison, the average person in Quebec province uses twice as much electricity than the average person in Ontario. And they don't even know it, and that's just because they have such a glut of electricity that they use from all the northern dams in Quebec, that it's just been so cheap and so plentiful, there's no incentive to conserve. So this is kind of a technical graph, but I want to point out in the center here, So the whole line is, January to December, approximately our electricity use in the province. And it peaks on those hot summer days in the summer, July and August, when our air conditioners are going full out. That's when we actually have to provide electricity. Those are called peak summer days, and there's only about 12 summer days where electricity peaks. And to meet those peak days, we actually build peaker plants. So we build natural gas peaker plants to meet those few days of the summer when it's super hot. And that's what the Mississauga and Oakville plants were natural gas peaker plants, and they were canceled because of public opposition. And in fact, if we were really thinking smartly about how would we meet our electricity needs, it would make sense for us to figure out how to meet those peak days without having to run inefficient and very expensive peaker plants, because those plants are the most expensive type, and because they're sitting idle most of the year. And then when we do crank them up for those dozen days, it's super inefficient and blasts out lots of emissions that make it very inefficient and super high polluting. So how can we meet those needs? Well, interestingly, those are the times when we have solar, the most solar in our province. So why wouldn't we be meeting those 12 days with solar or other forms of electricity? But also, what about just conserving? If we could actually conserve on those days and reduce our demand, we could avoid the need of building peaker plants. So that's part of the focus of our analysis with the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, which was behind the coal phase-out. Now we're putting our attention to the province's nuclear ambitions. So right now the province, all the nuclear plants were built in this province in the 70s and 80s. And they're all old now. They're all can-dos. They're 30 years old. The province has to think about how they're going to replace those reactors when they come to the end of their lives. Incidentally, Ontario is second only to France as the jurisdiction on the planet that gets most of its electricity from nuclear power. So France gets about 75% of their electricity from nuclear power. Ontario gets 57%. We have 20 nuclear reactors. We're second to France, the most nuclearized jurisdiction on the planet. And those plants are all getting old. The government wants to replace them. So what their plans are in our long-term energy plan is to extend the life of the Pickering station by 5 years. Meanwhile, rebuild 4 of the existing reactors at Darlington. They just canceled building 2 new reactors at Darlington after spending several $100 million. They canceled that. And then they want to rebuild 4 reactors at Bruce. So we're looking at 10 new or rebuilt and extended, 8 rebuilt reactors and the extension of Pickering, which is 6 working reactors. So this is going to cost upwards of $80 billion. So how might we meet our electricity needs in a more intelligent, lower cost, greener way? Let's look at what some alternatives are. At the far right, we have the Darlington rebuild project, which we estimate will cost between 19 and 37 cents a kilowatt hour. Just keep that number in mind. Wind, the feed-in tariff for wind is 11.5 cents. Combined heat and power, which is an efficient way of using natural gas, much more efficient than our current use of natural gas in the province, 6 cents. And we propose that as essentially a transition fuel to get us to a 100% renewable grid. Hydro import from Quebec, it says 5.8, but in fact, the most recent contracts that the Quebec has been signing with all the US northeastern states is 4.1 cents. And then energy conservation, which is around 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So there are much cheaper ways than rebuilding Darlington to meet our electricity needs. And incidentally, they're a lot greener and don't have nuclear waste.
You mentioned geothermal.
But, because it's still quite marginal and it's still very expensive. So it's coming down, it's becoming more common. It's the same thing with solar, we don't have that up there. And because at this point it's still not cost competitive, with like it's around 30 cents a kilowatt hour compared to the Darlington, which is around the same. So there's no question that solar, geothermal, and wind energy will, in a couple of decades, we're saying by 2030, replace all the nuclear reactors. And just by way of comparison, every nuclear reactor in Ontario's history has gone on average 2.5 times over budget. So when they say it's only, the rebuild is only going to cost $14 billion, we can multiply that by 2.5, and that's where we get the Darlington rebuild costs. So nuclear accidents are not rare events. We've seen in recent decades 3 to 5 major incidents per decade is essentially what we're looking at. But Fukushima, post-Fukushima, the world shifted and decided we were not going to move forward with new nuclear. Even France, the most nuclearized nation on the province, is committed to reducing its nuclear arsenal to 50%, up from 75 down to 50. So they're committed to reducing their dependence and reliance on nuclear power. Meanwhile, Ontario is committed to maintaining the status quo. Germany, post-Fukushima, committed to phase out 100% of their nuclear reactors, as have some other countries. They've definitely canceled reactors all over the planet. Globally speaking, nuclear provides less electricity this year than it did in previous years, and it's basically on a downward decline, while renewable energy is on an upward decline. Incline, thank you. And you can see this is where all the investment dollars are going. The upper line that's all renewables. That's private and government investments are all going into the renewable energy industry, whereas nuclear is going down. And the only countries or the only states or jurisdictions that are investing in nuclear, it's not private dollars, it's essentially all government subsidies that are keeping nuclear alive. So this is just to show that Ontario has so many green energy options that if we could postpone or kill the nuclear projects that the province has in mind, because essentially they're committed to receiving more than 50% of our electricity with nuclear power. If we could pull those offline, that completely opens up the grid for geothermal, solar, wind, biomass, biogas. All those options will be on the table. And then what we're proposing right now to avoid the Pickering extension and the Darlington rebuild is to flip the switch on for hydro water imports from Quebec. And essentially they have so much excess electricity, they're selling it to the US at very low rates, and even there they have much more than the US can take, especially now that natural gas is flooding the market. It's even cheaper because of course they're not paying for their environmental impacts, be it climate change or fracking. But Quebec does not have enough markets for the rivers that it has dammed. So I'm not saying that hydro or water imports or water damming of rivers is a good thing, but they have access. It's inexpensive, it's renewable, they've already dammed the rivers, they're looking for markets, and they're selling it for 4.1 cents a kilowatt hour versus what our province is pursuing, which is nuclear, which even if we use the government estimates of 8 cents a kilowatt hour, the hydro imports are half of that. And we already have the transmission grid between the two provinces to replace 86% of Darlington. So we've already got the infrastructure in place, so it would be an easy flip of the switch. So what do we do? I would invite you to, we're inviting everybody in the province to let the Premier know, basically all of the parties tell us that they never hear from the public about energy, or there's no opposition, no organized opposition to nuclear, but there's so much organized opposition to wind and even solar, believe it or not. So we're trying to support the public in engaging in the issue and letting the Premier know, and the Ontario Clean Air Alliance has weekly bulletins that we send out, emails saying, click here to send a message to the Energy Minister, click here to send a message, and they're already pre-formed letters, so we make it really easy for you to let the elected body know what our concerns are relative to electricity and specifically anti-nuclear messaging. And we also have these postcards that are directed to Kathleen Wynne saying, I prefer water power to nuclear power. So flip the switch on hydro. And I'll just send these through the audience. I have 100, so if everybody took 2, then please mail them in, or if you were to leave them for me, I could mail them in for you, or Lynn could mail them in. You do have to put a stamp on them because they're provincial government. And also, I have some more resources here and online if anybody's really keen, but I also have an email list that if you're interested in being kept up to speed on energy issues and environmental issues, please just leave me your email address. I'm happy to add you. If it's too much, you can just delete yourself, but it's a way that I can stay in touch with you and vice versa. So I'll circulate these, and thanks very much.
Can't you mail them in the trailer at Queen's Park?
Yes, you can,
Without a step?
for free. That's right. Yes, you can. Thank you, everybody.